Hello. The murder of Miles Seton by Colonel Rutherford in January of 1919 in London led to a major trial of that year. It was of great interest to the press and the public, chiefly because it involved the emotion of insane jealousy. But is insane jealousy insanity? British law would say not. But the defense argued that Colonel Rutherford was in a state in which he was not in control of his actions when he committed the crime. See what you make of it. Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford left his house at Carshalton Place in Surrey at 5 to 9 on the evening of the 13th of January, 1919. He went to the railway station and there collected a car key kit bag from a maid who had brought it there for him. He then caught the train to London Victoria, which took him around 30 minutes. Here he deposited the bag with some clothes and personal effects in it in the soldiers' and sailors' cloakroom. From here he turned left out of the station into Victoria Street and entered the theatre ticket office at 195 Victoria Street and requested to see a street directory. He studied this, but, unable to find what he was looking for, the manager of the ticket office offered to assist him. "I shall be very much obliged to you," said Colonel Rutherford. He told him he was looking for the address of Sir Malcolm Seton, but knew only his name and the area in which he lived, Holland Park. The manager succeeded in finding this, and told Colonel Rutherford the address, which he scribbled on the back of an envelope. 13 Clarendon Road, W11, he wrote. It was now a little before 10. Colonel Rutherford took a cab to Holland Park, arriving at number 13 Clarendon Road at around 10:15. He rang the bell, and a Miss Amy Millward, parlour-maid, opened the door. "Is this the home of Sir Malcolm Seton?" Colonel Rutherford inquired. "Yes, sir," said Amy. "I'd like to see Major Miles Seton," he said. The maid invited the colonel into the hall and asked his name. "Colonel Rutherford," he told her, and she went to fetch Miles Seton, who was in a smoking room with Sir Malcolm and his wife Lady Frances Seton on the first floor. Amy informed Major Seton that a Colonel Rutherford wished to see him. Thinking he was a friend of Major Seton's, Lady Frances said, "Oh, won't you bring him up here?" But Major Seton simply said, "I'll see what he wants," and left the room, going downstairs to the hall. He and Colonel Rutherford were seen by the maid entering the dining room and closing the door after them. After about 10 or 20 minutes, according to various estimates, 4 or 5 gunshots, fired in rapid succession, were heard. Sir Malcolm and Lady Seton ran downstairs to find the dining-room door open, and the body of Major Seton lying face down on the threshold, his legs in the room, his upper body stretched out into the hall. Inside the dining room, some 12 to 14 feet away on the other side of the dining table, was Colonel Rutherford, and on the table before him lay a pistol. Sir Malcolm said, "Did you do this?" "Yes," replied Rutherford. Lady Seton said, "You've killed Miles," to which Rutherford replied, "Yes, I only wish I had another bullet for myself." Sir Malcolm immediately went out to fetch a Dr. Brown at number 34 Clarendon Road, and from here went to the police station at Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, to report the murder. Meanwhile, Lady Seton supported the head of Miles Seton on her lap and gave him sal volatile, smelling salts, in an attempt to revive him. He was, apparently, still barely alive at this point. She heard a click, as if the colonel had pulled the trigger of the pistol, and said, "Put that down at once, and come here." He did, and she said, "Promise me you will not pick it up again." "I promise," he said. Then, after a short laugh, he said, "I should not have given you such a promise if there was a bullet left in it." He asked if she would burn a letter for him. She refused, but said he could burn it himself in the fireplace, which he did. Dr. Brown arrived at the house and pronounced Miles Seton to be dead. Soon afterwards, Sir Malcolm returned to the house with the police constable Andrews, who told Colonel Rutherford he would need to take him to the police station. "Can I get my cap and gloves and cane first?" inquired the colonel. P.C. Andrews agreed, after which he took Colonel Rutherford into custody. The divisional police surgeon, Dr. Chippendale, arrived next and examined the body of Miles Seton and found 3 bullet wounds to his chest. An Inspector Trott then arrived, followed at 12:30 a.m. by Divisional Detective Inspector Percy Savage, who made a careful examination of the scene. He found the gun used to be a Webley Scott automatic pistol, which was now empty. In all, 8 empty cartridge shells were found at the scene, and numerous bullet holes to the door, framework, and wall were in evidence. Inspector Savage saw Colonel Rutherford at Notting Hill Police Station at 2:30 a.m. The latter gave his name as Norman Cecil Rutherford, and was then charged with murder, to which he made no reply. He asked if he could write a note to his wife. Savage gave him a piece of paper and pen, and he wrote, "I am sorry, an awful thing has happened. Seton is dead. Norman." Police recovered a number of items from the body of Miles Seton and from his room, including a photo of himself with Mrs. Rutherford. They also recovered the kit bag Rutherford had deposited at Victoria Station and discovered a number of letters from Rutherford's wife, which indicated that the couple had a poor relationship, that Mrs. Rutherford was accusing her husband of cruelty and infidelity and begging him not to put obstacles in the way of a divorce. Norman Cecil Rutherford was born in West Riding of Yorkshire on the 14th of March, 1882, the eldest son of Dr. James Rutherford, a general medical practitioner who practiced in Shipley, Yorkshire. Norman attended Salt School there, where he was a well-liked and intelligent boy, after which he studied at Edinburgh University and then at London Hospital, before qualifying as a doctor in 1903. While still a student, he met Alice Maud Roberts, the second daughter of Sir James Roberts, owner of Saltaire Model Village and a Yorkshire textiles magnate of considerable wealth. In 1898 he had sold his textiles business for £1.5 million. That's approximately £250 million in 2023. Sir James opposed any ideas of marriage between the young couple. He was something of a Russophile, spoke fluent Russian, and according to the family, he had set his heart on a titled Polish suitor for her. But Alice was a strong-minded girl and was going to have her own way in the matter, and she and Norman Rutherford eloped to Scotland, where they married in Fife in 1902. There followed an inevitable estrangement between the now married couple and her father, but after a time they were reconciled. They spent time in South Africa after Rutherford had qualified as a doctor, and then Norman obtained a position in Sir James's employment. It didn't last, though, and Norman returned to medicine, acquired further medical qualifications in surgery from Edinburgh and Glasgow, and became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1909. The couple had 6 children between 1904 and 1915, who, at the time of the murder, were aged between 4 and 15. At the outbreak of World War I, Rutherford was a captain in the Medical Corps, and was eventually promoted acting lieutenant colonel of the 3rd West Riding Ambulance Column, serving in France throughout the war with distinction. He was awarded the DSO in September 1917 for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty when in charge of an advanced dressing station. He was also mentioned in dispatches in December of that year. He had returned from duty on the 6th of January 1919, just 7 days prior to the murder. Colonel Rutherford had known the deceased, Major Seton, for some years. Seton was born Miles Charles Carriston Seton in 1874. He too studied at Edinburgh University, practicing in Scotland and then Melbourne, Australia, after qualifying. In 1900 he was in South Africa and volunteered his medical services as a doctor during the Boer War, for which he received 2 war medals. He seems to have met Rutherford in Edinburgh and his then fiancée, Alice, in 1902. Rutherford was then still a medical student, and according to police inquiries, Seton became very much attached to Alice. Police were confidentially, but reliably, according to the Scotland Yard file, informed that Miles Seton had, consequent upon this, sold his Edinburgh practice and left Edinburgh. He went to Melbourne, Australia, where he practiced until the outbreak of war, when he was appointed a captain in the Australian Army Medical Corps. He served in Egypt in 1916 and was medical officer at Suez before being sent to Park House Camp, Tidworth, that same year, where he renewed his acquaintance with the Rutherfords and then served as medical officer at a variety of posts in England. On the day of his murder, he was appointed Regimental Medical Officer at the Australian headquarters, Horseferry Road, Westminster. Major Seton had been a guest of Colonel Rutherford at his home in Frith Manor, Mill Hill, in October 1916. This seems to have marked the beginning of the renewed acquaintanceship between the Rutherfords and Miles Seton. It is known that Major Seton's visits continued hereafter on a regular basis, his staying at the house when Colonel Rutherford was absent in France. And from the summer of 1918, he had spent a great deal of time at the Carshalton house of the Rutherfords, dining there and taking Mrs. Rutherford to dinner or out to the theatre. His attentions to Mrs. Rutherford intensified as 1918 drew to a close. A great many taxi journeys by Mrs. Rutherford were totted up, involving Seton or a rendezvous with him. She told her driver not to tell her husband who she had been with or where. She stayed at a hotel in Carshalton while awaiting redecoration of Carshalton Place, and Miles Seton was identified as being a visitor there. She stayed at other places too, at Weymouth at a time when Miles was stationed there. There was talk. It was widely believed that they were lovers. A decorator at Carshalton Place during September and October 1918 saw Seton on numerous occasions at the house and saw the two taking walks together. Major Seton was clearly staying at the house. A chauffeur said that the men in work thought there was something wrong about Mrs. Rutherford and often spoke of it. The implication was that she was conducting herself improperly with Major Seton in her husband's absence. The driver told police, however, that when her husband, Colonel Rutherford, asked him where he had taken his wife one day and whom she had been with, he said he couldn't remember. He did this, he said, because he had told Mrs. Rutherford he would keep her secret, and she tipped better than Colonel Rutherford, who only ever gave him a shilling. Finally, Miles Seton had spent Christmas week with the family at Carshalton Place from the 23rd of December to the 2nd of January 1919, just 4 days before Colonel Rutherford's return from France. Seton was receiving his mail at the house, and a photograph of himself with Mrs. Rutherford was found in his possession. By the time Colonel Rutherford returned on the 6th of January 1919, Seton had left. It may have been an uneasy 7 days, but husband and wife went to the cinema in midweek with the children, and on Sunday, the 12th of January, the day before the murder, Mr. and Mrs. Rutherford went to church with 3 of the children. Then on Monday, the 13th of January, something happened. A servant had seen Colonel Rutherford at around 5:30 p.m., and he seemed in good spirits. Then, at about 7 o'clock that evening, a row broke out in the bedroom. There were raised voices. Mrs. Rutherford rang the bell for a maid, and Winifred Louth, a housemaid, came to the door. The door was locked, and she couldn't gain entry, but heard the Colonel shouting angrily. At some point he opened the door of the bedroom and told her to go away. She remained nearby, however, heard the row continue, and Mrs. Rutherford was apparently dragged to another room by her husband. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Rutherford told her to pack the Colonel's bag for him. He was leaving. The maid asked the Colonel what she should put in it, and he said, "God knows, I don't." She packed the clothes she could find and reminded him that he had some letters in a drawer, which she believed he took. He told her not to bother about a gun lying on the sofa, as he would not need it, but to leave the bag open, as he wanted to put some cigars in there. The Colonel asked the parlour-maid to take his bag to the station for him, and then followed himself. It was this sequence of events which directly preceded the death of Miles Seton on that same evening, the 13th of January, 1919. A post-mortem was carried out on the body of Miles Seton by Sir Bernard Spilsbury. His brief report states that Miles Seton was 5 feet 10 inches in height, muscular, and in good health at the time of his death. He had suffered 14 wounds to his body as a result of bullets entering and passing through his body at a number of places. Spilsbury remarked that with the exception of one of these wounds, in which the bullet was discovered in the body, it was impossible to tell which were the exit and entry wounds. The single wound, whose direction and trajectory could be identified, had entered the right shoulder, passed through both lungs, and been stopped at the left shoulder blade, taking a horizontal course across the body. The cause of death was given as syncope due to hemorrhage from a bullet wound of the heart. Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford appeared briefly before magistrates at West London Police Court on the 14th of January and was remanded in custody by Chief Magistrate John de Grey and ordered to be conveyed to Brixton Prison by taxicab. Here he remained, choosing not to appear at the reconvened hearing of the magistrates' proceedings or at the subsequent inquest hearings. The inquest proceedings took precedence in the matter. The Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Archibald Bodkin, watched proceedings for the Crown, and Travers Humphreys appeared for Colonel Rutherford, while Sir Richard Muir appeared on behalf of Mrs. Rutherford, declining on her behalf to make any statement in court without the express desire of her husband that she do so. Evidence heard was principally that of the maids, Sir Malcolm and Lady Frances Seton, Spilsbury, and various police officers and doctors. The circumstances of the murder were given, and the jury duly returned a verdict of wilful murder against Norman Cecil Rutherford. The West London Magistrates' Court reconvened on the 5th of March. Rutherford reserved his defence and was duly committed for trial at the Central Criminal Court to be heard in April. The trial of Lieutenant Colonel Norman Rutherford began on the 6th of April 1919 before Mr. Justice Salter. The prosecution was conducted by the Attorney General, Sir Gordon Hewitt MP, and Sir Archibald Bodkin and Percival Clark assisted. Rigby Swift, K.C., and Travers Humphreys acted for the prisoner, and Sir Richard Muir again watched proceedings on behalf of Mrs. Rutherford. Colonel Rutherford entered the dock at the Old Bailey in soldierly manner, dressed in a light blue suit and blue tie, and took his seat. Asked how he pleaded, he declared, "Not guilty." The Attorney General, Hewitt, gave the circumstances of the murder, how Rutherford and his wife had been in an unhappy marriage for a number of years, how Major Seton had been a friend of the couple, and in 1916 had had his photo taken with Mrs. Rutherford in the garden of the house they lived in at Frith Manor, Mill Hill, that the Colonel had become increasingly jealous of Miles Seton, and that Seton had stayed at the house a number of times in the absence of the Colonel, including during the Christmas week, a few days prior to the Colonel's return from France. On the day of his return, the 6th of January, he told the jury, Mrs. Rutherford had asked a maid to remove 2 photographs from her bedroom and dressing room. These photos were of Miles Seton and of herself with Seton. During the days the Colonel was at the house, Letters arrived for Miles Seton, and in particular a letter which caused a quarrel between husband and wife on the day of the murder. It was as a consequence of this quarrel that Rutherford had travelled to the Clarendon Road house on the evening of the 13th of January, and had shot Major Seton a number of times with a pistol which he had brought to the house for this purpose. A number of letters were read by the Attorney General. One, from Mrs. Rutherford to her husband in France, read, "They advised me to get a divorce, but I refused with tears because I thought I still loved you. Now I know I do not." After 1917, she had asked repeatedly for a divorce and asked him to place no obstacle in the way of this. The Attorney General said, "There are motives, we know, act with great and compellent force in the minds of men, and of these motives surely the strongest are jealousy and revenge. It is a case of murder, deliberately planned, methodically and thoroughly carried out and appreciated by the doer. To anyone who brings his mind to bear upon the facts, the case admits of no defense excepting the defense of insanity." This presented the issue at stake to the jury in a straightforward manner, and it also suggested the defense case, that of insanity. In truth, there could be no other. As at the inquest, the material witnesses were called who spoke to the events of the evening. The servants, Sir Malcolm and Lady Seton, Inspector Trott, duty officer at Notting Hill Police Station to whom the murder was reported, Dr. Chippendale, the police surgeon, and Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who had conducted the post-mortem examination, and who gave his opinion that Seton had been standing sideways in the doorway when he was shot by 6 to 8 bullets, which had caused 14 bullet wounds. Rigby Swift, K.C., acting for Colonel Rutherford, said, "There is no dispute as to the facts in the case as presented by the prosecution, but I shall ask you to say that the prisoner was insane at the time the murder was committed." 14 witnesses were called for this purpose by the defence. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Hill of the Royal Army Medical Corps said that in November 1916 Rutherford was suffering from severe eczema of his hands and feet. It had preyed on his mind. Dr. Hislop said Rutherford had told him, when he interviewed him, that he had dreamt in December that he had murdered Seton. When asked why he had done this, he told Hislop, "Major Seton has had an evil influence over my children." Hislop inquired in what way. "When I was in France, I heard that they were quarrelling among themselves," he said. "Do you consider that is sufficient reason to take a man's life?" Hislop asked. "I did," replied Rutherford. Dr. Hislop then asked him, "Have you anything to say against Mrs. Rutherford?" "No, nothing," he replied. Asked by counsel what conclusions he drew from this, Dr. Hislop said, "I am of the definite opinion that at the time of committing this act he did not know the difference between right and wrong." Dr. John Edward Sandilands, who had served under Rutherford in France, also spoke of Rutherford's eczema and his extraordinary outbursts of temper. He said that on occasions his manner became threatening and extremely insulting to subordinates, non-commissioned officers, and other junior officers. He said that on witnessing these he considered Rutherford to be suffering from some mental warp. Sergeant Major Bevans said that in 1916 Rutherford had been wounded in his right forearm, and he was treated for deafness. He also seemed to be suffering from shock. Questioned, he said he had witnessed him lose his temper for slight reason or no reason at all. Lieutenant Colonel John Macmillan, DSO, said Rutherford was sometimes domineering and occasionally had no control over his temper. Dr. Edwards, a mental specialist, said that when he interviewed Rutherford, he had resented the suggestion that there was anything wrong between Major Seton and Mrs. Rutherford, but he insisted the Major had a certain evil influence on the family as a whole. It was a short trial. In his final address to the jury, Rigby Swift said that on the medical evidence this was not a matter of impropriety between Seton and Mrs. Rutherford. It was one of insanity. The Attorney General resisted this to a degree, saying, bad temper is not insanity, and suggested that the colonel had performed his duties in an exemplary manner, which suggested he was sane. In summing up, Justice Salter said Dr. Hislop's suggestion that Seton had a pernicious influence on Rutherford's children was utterly inadequate as a motive, but might suggest the defendant was not of sound mind. He said there was no doubt the marriage was unhappy, and had been for some time, but it was for the defense to satisfy the jury that Rutherford was insane. But he cautioned them that it was not necessary for the person to be shown to be a raving lunatic, merely that they were not responsible for their actions. Thus charged, the jury left the courtroom. They were absent for just 5 minutes, and upon their return they gave a verdict against Colonel Rutherford of guilty of murder, but insane. Justice Salter ordered Rutherford to be detained during His Majesty's pleasure. This notorious phrase, in effect, means that the defendant, though found guilty, must be held in a secure unit indefinitely, until the Home Secretary deems he or she no longer poses a risk to society. This was the end of the legal proceedings insofar as the murder went. Rutherford was removed to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, where he was received into the gentleman's block, which gave extraordinary license to its well-connected inmates. He was permitted to have his own possessions, books and writing materials. He had his own tailored clothes and comfortable quarters, and he was permitted to receive money. This latter enabling him, in common with other inhabitants of the gentleman's block, to employ other inmates for various tasks. He apparently spent a great deal of time reading, studying, and enjoyed playing cards with another resident of the gentleman's quarters, Ronald True. Furthermore, he entertained visitors and wrote a book, an outline history of the First World War, although the authorities did not permit his name to appear on the cover with his co-authors, H.S. Scott and G.V. Carey. His friends took great pains to persuade the Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks, that Rutherford posed no threat and should be released from Broadmoor. His wife, Alice, commenced divorce proceedings against her husband immediately following the trial. It was to be a prolonged, frustrating business for her, but some information that had not been revealed at his trial emerged. Mrs. Rutherford alleged infidelity on her husband's part with a woman called Amy Richardson, who was a cousin of his. Amy Richardson denied this, although she admitted that Rutherford had been in her room at night to say good night to her. A maid testified that Amy had confessed her love for him, and Mrs. Rutherford said she had confronted her husband over the matter. In addition, during the proceedings, letters were produced which indicated that as well as being unfaithful to her, Rutherford had acted brutally towards her. She had written such things to him, and he had not, it was claimed, denied them in his letters to her, so it was suggestive that the accusation she made had substance. She said that in 1906 he had horsewhipped her on one occasion, and that he had forced himself upon her. A governess who worked for Mrs. Rutherford told police that Rutherford had confessed to his wife that he was sexually insane. Although there is no elucidation as to what this entailed, and it was quite definitely hearsay, Justice Branson considered the matter sufficiently proved and granted a decree nisi. But Amy Richardson, her reputation at stake, appealed, and the appeal was allowed in December of 1921. There was to be no divorce. No wrongdoing against Colonel Rutherford could be established. Mrs. Rutherford wrote angry letters to the press about the matter, but there was little she could do. She was bound to her husband, who was incarcerated, albeit comfortably, in Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, having killed her lover. None of this, in 1920, was sufficient grounds for divorce. She had to make the best of the situation she could, and in 1922 she obtained a legal separation. There are two striking features concerning the trial of Colonel Rutherford. First, there is no doubt that Colonel Rutherford was guilty of the murder of Miles Seton. He had been caught in the act, The circumstances in which Miles Seton was discovered were such that there was no other possible cause of his death, nor did the defense deny that he killed Seton. The second is that of Rutherford's defense, the claim that he was insane at the time he committed the murder and therefore could not be held responsible for his actions. In cases where insanity is the plea, in British law, as in most English-speaking countries, the definition of insanity is established by the Macnaghten rule. This arises from the case of Daniel Macnaghten, who, in 1843, shot Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel's private secretary dead. Macnaghten appeared to be suffering from delusions, and was thus ruled at his trial to be insane, and therefore not guilty. The case caused considerable public outrage, since it was believed that Macnaghten, whatever his mental defects, clearly understood right from wrong, and was therefore culpable. As a result of this, the House of Lords considered the matter, and introduced the Macnaghten rule, which states that everyone is considered sane, and it is for the defendant to prove that they are not. Furthermore, that insanity may exonerate a person from culpability only if they are incapable of telling right from wrong. More specifically, if a person is insane but understands that their actions are wrong and punishable by law, then they will still be culpable. Common examples of a situation where a person commits murder and would be judged to be insane and not therefore responsible for their actions would be where a defendant cuts a person's throat under the delusion that he is cutting a loaf of bread, or where a defendant cuts off a sleeping man's head because he has the deluded idea that it would be amusing to see the man looking for it when he woke up. Such examples are so utterly remote from reality that there is little difficulty in determining such a defendant would be insane and not therefore responsible for their actions. But an instance of a defendant believing his radio was talking to him, or malign creatures were hunting him, or killing a person knowing it was wrong in law to do so, and that if caught he would be punished, would be deemed responsible for his actions. It sets the bar high for insanity. Thus, a man like Ronald True may sit in the dock wearing a monocle with no glass in it, beaming at the proceedings in his murder trial, suffering delusions that he is being pursued around London by his alter ego, may be found guilty of murder, because he understood that what he did was wrong, that he would be punished by the law as a result of his actions. This was obviously the application which had to be made in the case of Colonel Rutherford. He was guilty of murder, but, the defense argued, he was insane and not responsible for his actions in shooting Miles Seton, and in this the judicial system was extremely felicitous in its treatment of Colonel Rutherford. The judge indicated that the onus was upon the defense to prove Rutherford's insanity at the time he committed the act. That was correct. The natural assumption must be that he was sane. But here there was astonishing license given to Rutherford by the court and by the prosecution. Under normal circumstances, the prosecution would be expected to call medical testimony to rebut the claims that Rutherford was insane. They would argue that whatever degree of mental stress he may have been suffering, he understood perfectly well that in shooting Miles Seton he was committing a crime, and that he would be punished for it. It should not have been very difficult to demonstrate this. The claims made by a procession of defense medical witnesses and associates were wafer-thin, insubstantial, and, for the most part, showed only that Colonel Rutherford was a very bad-tempered man, who frequently lost his self-control. The implication of the defense was that this had occurred as a result of his war service, that shell shock may have accounted for his behavior, and even his skin complaint of eczema. But it is clear from the testimony later given in the divorce courts that Rutherford was a man with a temper. It was claimed that he had horsewhipped his wife in 1906 when she had gone to rescue a child whom he was intent on punishing, and if raised in his trial would have given the jury pause. But it was not heard. None of the acts attributed to him during his war service are out of step with this. He occasionally roared at other officers who irritated him, exhibited arrogance and extreme rudeness towards them and towards NCOs and other ranks. These are not acts of insanity. They are the acts of a bad-tempered man, a bully. West Riding police, who were asked to give details about Rutherford's background, reported that his father drank heavily and was known for his violent temper. It seems his son was made in the same mould. He liked to get his own way, and his wife had resisted him for many years. That is clear from the correspondence between them, from the accounts of servants who witnessed incidents between them. In the divorce courts it was claimed that Mrs. Rutherford's brother, who was a lieutenant who also lived in Carshalton at this time, had found it necessary to intervene to protect his sister from Rutherford's violence. She had also expressed her fear of her husband, even advised a governess, Miss Hodgson, to lock her door against him on one occasion when he was in a bad mood. A man who had known Rutherford in 1900 in Edinburgh said he was extremely jealous of his fiancée, as Alice then was, speaking to other men. A servant said he had once burned photos of other men he found in the house in a fit of jealousy. All of the accounts we hear of Rutherford point to his behaviour being ill-tempered and to his being a jealous and violent character long before the war. His actions during the war were entirely consistent with those we hear of him prior to the war. But the prosecution never sought to obtain independent medical assessments of Rutherford. The only breach in the uniformity of opinion received was that by the prison doctor, Griffiths, who had watched Rutherford for the period of months he was on remand in Brixton, and interviewed him. He gave his opinion that Rutherford was insane at the time he committed the murder, but was now quite sane. That is a damaging opinion to submit to the scrupulous cross-examination of a Crown Counsel. A great many crimes of passion, whose motives are ones of jealousy and rage, are committed with soaring emotions and incandescent fury. Perhaps most violent crimes are, but in the English-speaking world there is no regard given to the crime passionnel, as there has been in France, for instance. There is an expectation that it should be punished with equal force as a murder committed for, say, monetary gain or revenge. Dr. Griffith's opinion here could have been damaging, but intriguingly it was delivered only as the briefest statement read in court. The doctor was ill and unable to attend court. No cross-examination could take place. That was fortunate for Colonel Rutherford. Of the other medical men who gave testimony, all either knew him, were associates, subordinates, or friends. They were hardly impartial assessors of Rutherford's mental condition, and they were all procured by the defence, and thus had a particular purpose. Miles Seton, as a victim, setting aside any other considerations, deserved better. Nothing is known to his detriment other than a long-standing admiration for Mrs. Rutherford, which, some time after 1916, had become an affair. Although Mrs. Rutherford denied there had been such an affair, and nothing was said in court to suggest this, again an obvious motive the prosecution should have exploited, it is all but certain that there was an affair. Mrs. Rutherford had grown tired of her husband. We know this from her letters. "Now I no longer love you," she had written. Miles Seton stayed at the house at Frith Manor and at Carshalton Place whenever he was home on leave, in the absence of Colonel Rutherford from 1916 on. He had stayed at the house during Christmas week. He exchanged letters with her. He had his photo taken with her, and 2 photos of Miles, one with herself, were hurriedly removed from Alice's dressing room and bedroom on the 6th of January, the day of her husband's return from France, and just 7 days before he shot Miles Seton. That Mrs. Rutherford kept 2 photos of Miles Seton in her private rooms, and he kept one of her in his wallet, is strongly suggestive. So were the various accounts of chauffeurs and drivers and tradesmen who believed there was an affair. More should have been made of this. It was not. A discreet veil of denial by the defence was implicitly accepted by the silence of the Crown. Colonel Rutherford was a jealous man. He knew of Seton's attentions to his wife. He knew of his association with her. He wrote angry letters warning him off. He must surely have learned of Miles Seton staying at the house during Christmas, from the servants or children. He would make it his business to know of it, because that is the nature of jealousy. Jealousy makes us do things we would never rationally do. He opened mail that arrived at the house. He probably went through her things. Why would he not, when he knew of Miles Seton? We know he questioned the chauffeur about this. We know he wrote Seton letters. He needed to feed his jealous fury with further proofs, because jealousy has a voracious appetite. He opened Seton's letters. In fact, he opened Seton's final letter on the evening of the 13th of January, around 7 p.m., just 3 hours before he shot Miles Seton dead. How do we know this? Because Seton was due to take over a new command at Horseferry Road that day, and would be quartered there also. But during the late morning he discovered that his predecessor in post would not have vacated the quarters by that evening. He must have written to Mrs. Rutherford informing her that he would be staying at his cousin Malcolm Seton's house at 13 Clarendon Road, because no one knew of it. Mrs. Rutherford did not, but Colonel Rutherford did. The only way in which Colonel Rutherford could possibly have known this vital detail is if he had intercepted a letter which Miles Seton had sent to Mrs. Rutherford informing her of this. We know that Miles Seton sent a letter that afternoon. We know that the postman delivered a number of letters at 6:45 p.m., one postmarked Westminster, and we know that something occurred at around 7 p.m. to cause a terrible row between husband and wife, and that after this, Colonel Rutherford went to 13 Clarendon Road and shot Miles Seton. And we also know that Rutherford burned a letter that evening after he had shot Seton. This was the letter. There is no other explanation for his acquiring the knowledge of Seton's whereabouts that evening, and the fact he wished to burn the letter suggests with great force that this was a letter Miles Seton had written to Rutherford's wife, informing her of this sudden, unexpected change of plans. Why did he burn it? For the same reason that he went to shoot Miles Seton when he had read its contents. We can never know what was written in that letter, but whatever it was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was certainly sufficient to cause Colonel Rutherford to throw caution to the furious wind, to fetch the pistol which was kept in a drawer in his daughter's room, to either load it or ensure it was loaded, and to march to Carshalton Station with the Webley Scott pistol in his pocket. He caught the train to Victoria. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes, and he was there at 9:54 p.m. All the way his mind was busy. He had revenge on his mind. This was a man who would roar insults, according to those who served with him, at anyone who annoyed him for whatever mild offence. He had a few insults for Miles Seton, who had stolen his wife. Whatever was in the letter, it was probably indicative of the love between Miles Seton and Alice. Miles had waited long enough, been waiting in the wings since around 1900, the police believed. His turn had come. He had never married. Now he was 44. The letter may have referred to Colonel Rutherford, to divorce, to plans together now that the war was over, to the children, to the future. Everything in that letter would anger Colonel Rutherford. Every reference to his children, to his house, to his wife, every familiarity was an affront to his friendship with Miles Seton. He had been outrageously cuckolded before his servants, before his friends, before his children even. He sought restitution for this wrong done him. It was his right. When he arrived at Victoria, he stepped outside into Victoria Street and left to the ticket office and asked to see the directory. He couldn't find Malcolm Seton's address, but the ticket office manager could. He gave it to Rutherford. He wrote it on the letter and caught a cab to Clarendon Road and knocked on number 13. The maid let him in. She noticed nothing amiss about him, no madness in his eyes. Such a thing would arouse her suspicions. There were none. He seemed calm, she said. He acted normally because he knew he needed to act normally. The maid told Miles Seton, who was upstairs in the smoking room with Sir Malcolm and Lady Seton. It was now around 10:15. Seton must have known there'd be trouble. He'd exchanged glances with Sir Malcolm and Lady Seton, but they didn't notice, and he left the room and went downstairs. He knew there would be trouble because Rutherford had sent him aggressive letters. He was in an affair with his wife. He had just spent a week with the family. He'd been staying in Rutherford's bedroom in his absence, and not only there, obviously. There'd been commuting between the bedrooms going on abundantly. Of course there'd be trouble. He would have to face it, but he had no idea what was coming. The two men went into the dining room and sat down at the table. Rutherford put his cap and cane and gloves on the table. He was still calm, suppressing his anger. They were opposite each other. This was not a friendly meeting. We are told by Sir Malcolm and Lady Seton and the maid that the two men were in the room for somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes, and nothing was heard. No raised voices. Presumably Rutherford told Seton what he thought of him, may have ordered him to stay away from his wife, even threatened him. An order of such a kind would require a threat to give it force, because an order is nothing without authority. Colonel Rutherford had only one source of authority, which was in his right pocket. But Seton was hardly going to meekly accept the order or the threat. He would naturally inform Colonel Rutherford that Alice and himself were in love. She no longer loved Rutherford. How he said this, in what manner, as a rational apology or defiantly, hardly matters. Rutherford was a man who lost his temper for the slightest reason. And here he had a reason. But such conversations as these have their limits, and they are quickly reached. And Seton would be glad to end it, rather than sit and trade insults. He stood up, and now came the moment of truth for Rutherford. Seton was leaving. He was dismissed. He had brought the moment to its crisis, and it had taken him nowhere. It never could. He knew it couldn't. That is why there was a loaded gun in his pocket, which he now drew. It was the ultimate authority of his intention. Miles opened the door to leave. He was on its threshold when the first shot was fired, like a punch in the back, and then 3 more as his legs folded beneath him, and he fell to the ground with successive bullets ripping into him. Spilsbury said Major Seton was probably standing sideways in the doorway. His initial post-mortem report is conspicuously and most uncharacteristically silent on all but the salient physical facts. Spilsbury was often criticized for the extent to which he theorized on how a crime was committed. But here he was silent. It is clear to me that Spilsbury did not wish to incriminate Rutherford. In any case, Seton lay in the doorway, fatally wounded. Rutherford was standing on the other side of the dining table, 14 feet away. And it was here, on the threshold, that Seton died. Was Rutherford insane, in spite of the testimony of the medical men and friends and associates called by the defense? It would seem not. He was, as the prosecution pointed out, able to function as a medical officer, and in his career, in an exemplary manner, and with distinction. He had his wits about him in ascertaining that his wife and Miles were having an affair, in intercepting the letter from Miles that evening. He collected the gun, ensuring it was loaded. He travelled to Victoria from Carshalton with purpose. He deposited his kit bag in the station cloakroom there, because it hindered him in the task which lay before him. He went directly to the ticket office outside the station to ascertain the address of Miles's cousin. He had purpose. He had an intention in doing this. These were not the acts of a disordered or confused mind, but rational, cogent ones of decision. He wrote the address down carefully. He did not trust it to memory. He offered the manager money, which the latter would not accept. He knew what he was doing. He was perfectly calm. He took a cab to Clarendon Road, and he found number 13. Inside he was fizzing with rage, yet he knew well enough to conceal this, to secure his purpose. An interview with Miles Seton. He could not rant and rave on the doorstep and hope for an interview. The maid saw nothing amiss and showed him in. He entered the dining room with Miles Seton, and when the moment came, he shot him dead. If this was madness, then there was, indeed, method and purpose in it. He was insanely jealous, certainly, but that is an entirely different thing to being insane, and the law does not give respite for insanity, which is the result of jealousy. In fact, one of its prime purposes is to discourage it. His insane jealousy caused him to do many rash and abnormal things, and it caused him to shoot his wife's lover, Miles Seton, dead. He was almost certainly going to shoot himself also. He said so. But in his fury, he emptied the pistol, unknowing, into Miles Seton. It is easy to do with an automatic pistol, which reloads the next bullet into its breech when one is fired. Lady Seton heard a click. He had obviously tried the gun, hopeful that there was another bullet, checking it had not merely jammed on him when it stopped firing. But it was empty. He was rueful when Lady Seton asked him to promise he would not fire the gun. "I would not give such a promise if there had been a bullet left," he smiled. He asked to burn the letter. He was thinking. He did not wish this to be found. It was the prompt upon which his jealousy had acted. He knew that. He understood it. He was rational. The police investigation was extraordinary. Why did Inspector Savage not interview him at 2:30 a.m. when he returned from the crime scene? He spoke with him, allowed him to write to his wife, but made no attempt to caution him and take a statement. Or we are told he didn't. There is no statement on file. There is none mentioned at inquest or in court proceedings. How scrupulous this seems to be in an age when police would commonly seek the most unfavorable conditions in which to obtain a statement from a suspect. No one even appears to ask why no such statement was taken. It beggars belief to suppose that no policeman on that evening asked the simple, obvious question, "Why did you do this?" And, "Was there animosity between you and Miles Seton? What was its cause? Why did you burn the letter? What did it say? What did you speak about for 10 to 20 minutes with Miles Seton in the dining room?" There are these basic questions, the natural ones, which still remain to us because we are told they were never asked. And would a man of Percy Savage's experience as a Scotland Yard detective, a man who would go on to become one of the Big Five, that is, the 5 divisional heads of the CID of Scotland Yard, fail to ask such questions? It seems highly unlikely. It seems to me that undue regard was given to Colonel Rutherford from the moment he was arrested. The circumstances of the crime and those involved, Sir Malcolm Seton of the India Office, a distinguished colonel and surgeon, a daughter of Sir James Roberts. The matter was known quickly at the highest levels, and it placed severe constraints on the investigation. I can make no other sense of the inadequacy of the police investigation. Why had detectives failed to unearth Amy Richardson's alleged affair with Rutherford? It came out only afterwards in the divorce courts. Initially, an officer was sent to Horseferry Road to retrieve the letters Major Seton had deposited in the bank and was known to keep amongst his possessions in a box. But the files fall silent on these. Nothing is said in court of them. They appear to have vanished. Presumably, these must have explicitly articulated the nature of Rutherford's suspicions concerning Seton and his wife. Their absence is a gaping hole in the prosecution case. Their effect would point to the extreme jealousy from which Rutherford was undoubtedly suffering and undermine his claim of insanity. And where are the letters Rutherford is known to have had in his bag retrieved from Victoria cloakrooms? These appear to have been pared to the bone, so that sections which refer only in vague terms to his wife's denials of her husband's accusations are discovered. There is nothing concrete. Nothing whatever is seen or quoted or referred to of Rutherford's letters to his wife. No attempt to obtain these from Carshalton Place appears to have been made at all. And what is even more surprising, no prosecution counsel refers to their absence. And these are hardly insubstantial men of law. Sir Archibald Bodkin, the Director of Public Prosecutions, is there. Gordon Hewitt, MP, the Attorney General himself, who was about to become the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales soon afterwards, leads the prosecution. The very first lawyer in the land, and yet he fails to ask the meanest of questions. It is hard to escape the conclusion that a delicate parlour game is being played in court, that a prosecution is being conducted with the utmost dexterity to ensure that every opportunity is given for the defence to succeed. It must surely have been the case that there was a general understanding by all those involved in the investigation of the crime and its prosecution in court that Colonel Rutherford murdered Miles Seton because he was jealous that the latter had stolen his wife. It must also have been known by medical men, and those who so readily accepted their word, that Rutherford was quite sane. They knew because they were intelligent men. Rutherford had shot his wife's lover, and they sympathized with him. In the case of Miles Seton, it was judged that he had transgressed against a fellow officer, and that, in some disquieting sense, Colonel Rutherford had exacted his own justice. Within a year of Colonel Rutherford's detention in Broadmoor, efforts were being made by his friends to secure his release. In 1926, it was declared by an official that there were 4 sane men in Broadmoor, and although he did not name them, it was widely assumed that Rutherford was one of these. In 1927, the newspapers got wind of the impending release of Rutherford, and it caused some disquiet. A question was asked in the House of Commons, and the Home Secretary said he had no official knowledge of this. A careful wording. It is not clear exactly when Rutherford was released from Broadmoor, but the announcement was made on the 11th of January 1929 that he had been released on an unspecified date previously, sometime during 1928. It was also judiciously leaked to the press that he had travelled to Canada and was living with his daughter by this time. It was learned at this time, too, that Colonel Rutherford had applied to be reinstated in the Medical Register of Great Britain, which he duly was. He clearly could no longer practice in Britain, but he worked as an eye specialist in Vienna and then Persia up until the late 1940s, when he retired to Coverham in Yorkshire. He visited South Africa in 1951, where he died from heart disease at St. Mary's Hospital, Pinetown, Natal, on the 6th of December 1951, at the age of 69. He requested that he be buried with his tin hat, a prized possession from World War I. Following her failed attempts to obtain a divorce from her husband in 1920 and 1921, Alice reverted to her maiden name of Roberts. In 1927, she changed her name by deed poll to Roberts, and those of all her children too. She finally achieved the divorce she had been seeking from Rutherford for 20 years in 1937. She was then 56 years old. She was able at last to move on, and the following year she married a clerk named Archibald Stuart Clark. They lived in the Isle of Man. She may not have lived happily ever after, but she lived until 1982, and died 4 months short of her 101st birthday, 63 years after her husband shot her lover, Miles Seton, dead.